but we'll be able to cut it and give people time to go to the restroom, do what you need to do. Amen. And so we're going to play that video. And
you all, if you have your Bibles, turn to Joshua chapter 4. We are continuing our series on memorial stones. We have this lesson and 3 more, and then we'll bring it to a close finally. And so let's get our main verse, Joshua 4 through 7.
Then Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the children of Israel, 1 man from every tribe. And Joshua said to them, "Cross over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and each one of you take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the children of Israel, that this may be a sign among you when your children ask in time to come, saying, 'What do these stones mean to you?' Then you shall answer them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. And these stones shall be for a memorial to the children of Israel forever."
Okay, so we're going to begin. We're going to look at a couple of things today. I'm telling the story of our church and our fellowship. We're looking at history, and we're learning lessons along the way. Many of these are great lessons. We're going to get to something good in a bit. But I'm also telling some dark stories. I'm telling some painful periods in our history. And so we're going to talk today about the split of 2000 in our 53, almost 54-year history in our fellowship. We have had a few splits. These are people that rebel and split off from us. We've already looked at the first one, which was 1990. Now we're going to look at the split of 2000. And then we'll look briefly at one in Australia that was in 2009. So let's look at the split of 2000. We talked before, and I told you how in 1990 we had a group of men rise up. Actually, they were trying to take over or oust Pastor Mitchell. That didn't succeed, but they left us and took about 100 churches. And I want to emphasize to you how much that was a surprise to Pastor Mitchell and basically everyone. We had never had anyone leave like that. And so Pastor Mitchell was not expecting it. No one dreamed that could be possible. The split of 2000 that we're going to talk about was not like that at all. If you had half a brain, as Dad used to say, if you were even mildly astute, you could see this one coming a long way off. It was a slow motion train wreck. And so what happened is we had men that had been saved in our church. We had men that had been discipled. Our method of training pastors is not Bible school. It's training in-house through the biblical process of discipleship. So you had people that were saved. They owed their salvation to Pastor Mitchell and our church. They were discipled, trained for ministry. They were launched into ministry, supported financially by us, and they were entrusted with ministry. But the nature of ministry for many of these men, the early days of ministry, it often involves struggle. Not everybody who goes out the first week, they are a raging success. There are difficulties. It's not going well. And so because of the struggle factor, you often have men, when they first go out, it's more natural for them to do one of two things. When you're struggling, you tend to rely on God because you're desperate for His help. You don't have any people coming, or you're not getting genuine conversions. You need money to survive. So you are relying desperately on God. And the other factor is, when you're struggling, it is easier to appreciate your pastor, the pastor who got you saved, the pastor who trained you for ministry, the pastor who gave you an opportunity, invested money, gives you advice when you're struggling. And so it is a natural thing that you are appreciative of the one who did those things for you. The problem is that some of these men began to succeed. They began to succeed numerically. Now they're no longer struggling with no people in their church. Some of them had sizable churches. No longer are they struggling to pay the rent and how are we going to eat. Some of them now had large resources coming in, and we would call that, and I'm using the term loosely, we could call that success. They had attention. Many of these men that we're going to talk about, people respected them because they had done a good job and they were helping people. People asked them to come to their church, their nation, and preach for them. People asked them for advice, so naturally that brings attention. Many of these men, they could travel. It's quite unique in our fellowship because we are a fellowship of churches. A pastor, you don't have to be in the ministry very long before you can go travel overseas to other nations. And many times they were preaching to large crowds and people are saying nice things to them and about them. It is in success that some people come in danger. Success is dangerous for some people. Let's read 2 Chronicles 26:15.
So his fame spread far and wide, for he was marvelously helped till he became strong.
Okay, until he became strong. So this is Uzziah crying out, oh God, you've got to help me. We got enemies who want to kill us. And so God helped. And the Bible said until he became strong, and that's when he started being in danger, started getting into trouble. This is one of the great difficulties that people have, is having a correct perspective when you succeed. Okay, let's get a little perspective before we get into the details of this. If you succeed at anything in life, it's all because of God. Do you understand this? It is all because of God. 1 Corinthians 4, verse 7.
Who says you are better than others? What do you have that was not given to you? And if it was given to you, why do you brag as if you did not receive it as a gift? Okay, the Bible says everything we have that is good comes from God. You say, yeah, but I worked hard. Who gives you the strength to work hard? Yeah, but I'm really smart. And who made you smart? Right? It all comes from God. So this text is fascinating. Why do you brag as though you didn't receive it? It all comes from God. That's a healthy perspective in life. That doesn't mean that you are worthless and you did nothing, but it all comes from God. Perspective number 2, if you succeed, now we're talking in the things of God, if you succeed in part, it is because of your pastor. Right? So these men now, their churches are growing, they're getting money, they're getting attention, people are saying nice things, but their pastor had something to do with that. Shepherd is what the word pastor literally means. Shepherd is one who guided into salvation, guided into ministry, guided into the place where they are. Joshua 1, verse 6.
Be strong and of good courage, for to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to their fathers to give them.
Okay, this is actually how all of God's kingdom works. The inheritance is something good that God has planned for your life, but God says, Joshua as the leader or the man of God, the people enter their inheritance through a man of God. He helps. You have something to do with it. You have to lay hold of God. Yes, yes, yes. But in part, it's because of a man of God. And the third thing, now we're talking about these men who are pastoring and succeeding. In part, it is because of the fellowship, the greater group. Philemon, verse 23 and 24.
Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, greets you, as do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, Luke, my fellow laborers.
Okay, now here is the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, he must have had it going on. He must have been a brilliant man. He wrote most of the New Testament. He had miracle ministry. He pioneered, he established. He wrote most of the New Testament. And yet when he writes, he says, my fellow laborers. In other words, he didn't just say, I, the Apostle Paul, I have got it going on. Did I tell you how I was caught up to heaven? That's not what he says. He says, I have fellow laborers. They're with me. We do this together. Okay, that is a healthy perspective. Now, here is a very important lesson. You can file this away for yourself later on. The lesson we need to look at is the danger of pride. 2 Chronicles 26:16.
But when he was strong in his heart, and his heart was lifted up to his destruction.
Okay, this is talking about Uzziah. We read before, he was marvelously helped till he was strong. And now this is the follow-up verse. But when he was strong, his heart was lifted up. The word pride literally means to be lifted up to his destruction. You know what's very, very sad in life is that few people can survive success. Okay, there's an old saying is that for every 100 people that can survive adversity, only one can survive success. And that's a shame because we need people to succeed. Here's the problem now. We're going to talk about how this affected these men who are succeeding, all because of God, partly because of your pastor, partly because of the fellowship at large. We start to take credit for what God has done. We start to take credit for what others have done for us. This was Moses. The Bible said that his destiny changed when he came. He strikes the rock and he says, must we bring water from the rock? Any of you, have you ever been able to get water out of a rock? Try that when you get home. You got any in the garden? Go see how well you do. Moses, that's pretty. Must we bring water out of the rock? You're taking credit for what only God can do. 1 Corinthians 4:7.
Who says you are better than others? What do you have that was not given to you? And if it was given to you, why do you brag as if you did not receive it as a gift?
Okay, and this now is that verse repeated here is the problem in pride. Why are you taking credit for what God has given you? Why do you take credit for what other people gave you? And here's the problem. We had a number of pastors. I wish I was telling you about, horrible gangster criminals. They weren't. They were pastors who started to become inflated with pride. Two things. The word pride, I pointed out, one meaning of it means to be lifted up. Proud people think they are above. So the two ugly sides of pride, number one, people who think they're above start to despise, which is look down on, as being lesser. They despise other people. And unfortunately, the second part of pride, they start to despise spiritual authority. In this case, these men started to despise their own pastor. Pastor Mitchell, 2 Chronicles 26:19.
Then Uzziah became furious, and he had a censer in his hand to burn incense. And while he was angry with the priest, leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priests in the house of the Lord, beside the incense altar.
Okay, here is Uzziah. Now is the outflow. We said he was strong and he was helped until he was strong. Then the Bible says he was lifted up to his destruction, and this is how it manifests. He was angry with the priests. He was angry with the men of God. God appointed them. He put them in place, and so now he's despising them. I can do what you do, because that's what pride always produces. The split of 2000, so we had 1990, a number of men left. Now, in the next 10 years, There were 5 main leaders who went down this road of pride in despising. There were others that were affected, but there were 5 main leaders in this. These men, number one, they spoke despising words about others. I know because I was privy to their conversations many times. I could hear their conversations. Everyone were idiots but them. That's how they talk. These are men of God. But they look at this guy. Can you believe it? Anybody ask a question like, what kind of idiot doesn't know that? They despise. They felt they were on a higher plane. I want to tell you, there's nothing attractive about that. That's ugly. To speak despisingly about others. They spoke despisingly about their home church. 4 out of 5 were from this church. And when they talked about the church that got them saved, they're not in hell today because of this church. Those, podunk hicks. That's how they talk. The church that invested money in them. They spoke despising about how hokey and bad their home church was, and above all else, they despised their pastor. They wouldn't be saved without Pastor Mitchell, but they despised him. One of these men never had his own pastor preach in his church for more than 10 years. He had never had Pastor Mitchell come and preach. Now, if you asked him, he would say it was because, Pastor Mitchell offended him, and he was bitter. But the real issue, it was just pride. He thought that he was better than his pastor because that's what pride does. These men started separating their church, their people, their pastors. They started separating from Prescott. Started separating from the fellowship. Here's a repeated theme you're going to hear me talk about when I talk about rebellion. Rebels lie. So, a natural thing for years, people in their churches knew it's Prescott Conference, we'll go to conference. These men started lying to their people and telling them, Pastor Mitchell does not want you to come. He doesn't want you there. No, it's not for you. It's only a pastor's conference. So you're in the body. Pastor Mitchell doesn't want you to come to a pastor. That was a lie. We've explained the basis of conferences. But the point of doing that, they didn't want their people to have any connection with Pastor Mitchell, the Prescott Church, and the larger fellowship. One of these men, he pastored in Yuma. He's the one that didn't have Pastor Mitchell preach for more than 10 years. A funny story that Pastor Mitchell, it's funny, not in a good way, but there was a healing crusade that finally he deigned to attend, that he wasn't preaching, Pastor Mitchell was preaching. One of the men in his church asked Pastor Wayman Mitchell, the founder of the fellowship and the one who sent someone to his city where he is saved now. He asked Pastor Mitchell, he said, are you still up there in Prescott pastoring? He had no idea where Pastor Mitchell was because his pastor kept his people away from them. This actually, we have the pioneer rallies. This is actually where the idea of pioneer rallies came from. Joe Campbell recognizing what these men were doing, and Pastor Mitchell recognizing this, they said, we if they're lying and saying we didn't want them to come to conference, so then they said what we need is pioneer rallies outside of conferences so some of these people in the church can have a connection with the fellowship at large. These men who were pastors, they actually were some of the leaders of the fellowship. The words that they spoke were outrageous pride. Several of them, they were ones that took offerings at the conference, and they would say words like, if we don't take offerings at conference, there wouldn't be any money at all. God heard those words, fortunately, and he has made sure that that is not true. A common statement that these men said was, we are the fellowship. Talking about this wonderful gathering, this miracle of what God has done. They said, we are the fellowship. In other words, we're the reference points. We're the reason for its existence. We are the fellowship. One leader made an absolutely outrageous statement. He said, as a matter of fact, I'm more fellowship than Pastor Mitchell. Oh, do you understand how outrageously stupid that is? The pride of that is outrageous. Some of you may remember this at conference when these men preached in the conference. Their sermons, they took shots, they attacked people. It was whatever, they delighted in just, I'm not talking about conviction and whatever, they just shot at people. And it was always a cringe. And during those, there was an ugly few years in the fellowship. Coming to conference, it especially was horrible when you're a missionary. You're a missionary, you desperately need to come and hear good preaching. And then it's like, oh, why is he saying that? And man, that was funky. Just attacking and shooting at people. In conference, they were constantly maneuvering. They would often, most of the time, they would never sit in the service. They always would hang out at the back or outside. They would catch people, and they were trying to talk people out of doing the will of God. If they heard that someone was thinking about going overseas and becoming a missionary, they would take them aside and say, don't do that. That's stupid. You'll never have that size church again. And they would try to talk people out of obedience in doing the will of God. In the leadership meetings that we had, I explain every January we meet, the leaders of the fellowship meet, we discuss issues. Leadership was tense and it was funky because these men were obstructive. They delighted in being contrary. Whatever Pastor Mitchell said, they took the opposite position. I'm convinced if Pastor Mitchell said Jesus is God in the flesh, they'd have said, no, he ain't, just to be obstructive. That's how they were. They just delight, like seventh graders that never grew up. So many people, as I said, this could be seen. A lot of people saw this, and many people said to Pastor Mitchell, why do you put up with that? Why don't you just remove these guys? But Pastor Mitchell took the larger picture, and he said, some of them, they have pastors and churches out. If we do that, if I just step in and remove them, which he would have had the right to do, we're going to lose many more people and many more pastors and churches who don't understand the issues than we need to. Probably we're going to lose people, but we're trying to minimize the damage. I discussed with you before about the damage that rebellion does. But here is a lesson I want you to listen to. Rebels always overplay their hand. And that is a saying that Pastor Mitchell drilled into me through the years. He said, Greg, rebels will always overplay their hand. They'll go too far, which will cause them to lose credibility. So we had something arise, and it was called Brownsville, Pensacola. This was the Assembly of God Church in Pensacola, Florida. They had this, what they said was revival. Christians from all over the world started flying there, bizarre manifestations of various kinds. It was a kind of a follow-on to the Laughing Revival in Toronto. And so these leaders spoke well of it. Numbers of them traveled to the Brownsville Assembly of God in Pensacola, and they encouraged other people to do this. The man who is a part of this rebellion, he was pastoring in Gallup, New Mexico, used to be the assistant here in Prescott. He got into this and he preached around, remember what I said, rebels lie. And he, in telling of the glories of this wonderful move of God, he preached a sermon on the tabernacle of David, and the heavy emphasis was worship, worship, worship. And he said, when we got into that, the next Sunday, 100 people walked through the door. I remember in Australia, they were like, and he said 100 people. It was a lie. The Assembly of God in Gallup, New Mexico had a huge church split, and 100 members of the Assembly of God walked in the doors. He lied. And as easy as the 100 came, you better believe they also left. But that was it. And so here they're into this. So what began to happen? There were people who began to understand. Pastor Mitchell took a hard stand. He said, this is not God. It will cause destruction. It wound up causing massive destruction in the Assembly of God from this. But this was what God began to use. One of the 5 leaders, he made a number of foolish decisions in his home church, lost credibility. He had to wind up resigning. Another of these men, the one that would not have Pastor Mitchell come and preach for him, some of his own pastors began to speak out about his abuse. And finally, a board of elders meeting was called to address this. And at the end of it, it was clear by his attitude, his treatment of people, the board of elders asked him to resign. They were willing to allow him to pioneer, do something else, but he's way beyond pioneering. He refused, and so he pulled out of the fellowship. His obstructionist twin in Santa Fe also pulled out at the same time. Their buddy in Gallup, New Mexico wanted to, but he lacked courage. And so he stalled and waited and actually resigned, and thank God Tom Payne was able to take Gallup, New Mexico and save that church. But there was residual damage. I described this before. Always when you do that, some of their pastors, some of their churches joined this. We lost 3 conference churches. We lost probably in the neighborhood of 95 churches. I have, from my father's Bible, have a picture here I want you to see. This is my dad's Bible, September 6th of 2000, and here he writes the names of these men: Coolidge, Johnson, Houghton, Maston. These were ringleaders of the 2000 rebellion, and he is speaking here, my mouth is enlarged over my enemies. These men, they became enemies. They did all they could to destroy the fellowship. Ultimately, one of the men on the screen there, that he came to start a church in Prescott Valley. He used to be the assistant here. And remember, I said about rebellion is fed by pride. He and his wife said, we built the Prescott church. And I want to tell you, that's a special kind of delusional. That was their opinion, and they thought by them coming and starting a church in Prescott Valley, they were going to clean out the church and they were going to rise to great heights. Another picture I want to show you out of my dad's Bible is here. November of 2001, about the time he was starting this church, is God spoke to him, "It shall not stand." And this came to pass. He stayed for a few years, drew only a few people, and then that church fizzled out. One more photo from my dad's Bible is here. There was no day like it before and after it, that the Lord hearkened to the voice of a man, but especially the last line, "For the Lord fought for Israel." And he writes that man's name, Johnson, August of 2003. And Dad applied that to the Prescott church, is God did not allow the Prescott church to be destroyed. What was very sad, this man used to be the assistant here, is looking back through the years, for many years, there would be people that would just suddenly leave the church. And after this rebellion, looking back, Dad and I were able to pinpoint somewhere along the line they had connection with this man when he was the assistant. Because even since I started this series, I've had people come and say, you know what he told me one time? He lied and he poisoned and just dropped things against Pastor Mitchell and against the fellowship. What a legacy. How'd you like that to be your legacy? Dr. Death, everyone who came in contact with him, he did damage to them. And now he's a rent-a-rebel. Is every time we have somebody who winds up leaving the fellowship, you can bet he'll be preaching there in a few weeks. How sad. A man who used to build for God, now that's his legacy, is trying to do damage and destruction. Here's a lesson. This lesson was suggested by Pastor Mark Olson. He said, Greg, you need to have a lesson, WWD, what would Wayman do? And what he's talking about is, how should you react? How should you react when things don't go right? How should you act in life? What would your reaction be when people betray you, when people try and harm the work of God? 2000. Now we have a split. We're losing, as I said, roughly around 95 churches or so. Joe Campbell and Mark Olson. Joe Campbell pastors in Chandler, just down in the valley. Mark Olson in Tempe, down in the valley. Joe Campbell said to Mark Olson, let's go encourage Pastor Mitchell. So they called and said, let's go to lunch. And they drove up here to Prescott and meet with him. I want to put the quote that Mark Olson wrote down for me. Mark Olson said, the second that's Pastor Mitchell, saw us, he said, I don't know what you're going to do, Campbell. And I don't know what you're going to do, Olson, but I'm going to plant churches. And they said, yes. So what would Wayman do? What do you do when things are not going well? You stick to what God told you. That's what you do. You don't change your mind. And regardless of circumstances, that's exactly what Pastor Mitchell did. I described to you in 1990 when he was blindsided temporarily. He was rocked and thought about not doing it, but never again was he ever like that. Is when there was a problem, he said, we are going to do the will of God, and we're not stopping. I don't care what people say. God told us what to do. And he said, that is what would Wayman do. The highest lesson that we take, and we'll move on now to something better in just a minute. The highest lesson from the split of 2000 is you have to keep your heart right. You got to keep your heart right when things are bad, when things are good. Number one, you need to maintain gratitude because gratitude is protective. Number two, we need to maintain humility. You know what it means to be humble? Humble doesn't mean, I don't know why they asked me to sing. I can't really sing. Then sit down, we'll get somebody else. That's not humility. Humility is just simply honest recognition of the facts. Are you succeeding? Are you doing great? Okay, you owe God and your pastor and the people in your church and in the fellowship. That will keep you. You know, it's amazing. Some of these men that I just put their names up, they were fellowship rock stars at one point in time. They preached all the conferences. Everybody knew their name. We are the fellowship. I must confess, I chuckle every single time we're having breakfast. Every once in a while, one of their names comes up and someone will make a comment about them. And numbers of people at the table will go, who? And I laugh. Like, oh yeah, we are the fellowship. There are thousands of people who have no idea who they are. Because that is the truth about pride. You think you're hot, God will bring you low. And you think you're indispensable, stick your arm in a bucket of water, pull it out, and the hole that's left, that's how much you're going to be missed. That's the real truth of life. Now let's move on to something better. Let's talk about Chinle and the Navajo Nation. A worker, as we said in an earlier lesson, was sent to Chinle around 1975. And I was speaking about Gallup, but the first worker was sent, not from Prescott, but was sent to Chinle around 1975. We actually have some photos Here was a man, he was sent from Colorado, if I remember right. He was the original pastor. I have a picture of the original building in Chinle. That is the original building that they ever had. That building was built by Ike Coog, Greg Malinowski, some of the men from the church, Bob Allen. There were a few, and they went and built that building there. 1980, Glenn and Donna Cluck took over the church in Chinle, and they pastored from 80 to 83. We have some pictures of the Clucks here. They had a tent that they used to have a campaign every year. The next pastor who took Chinle from the Clucks in 1990 was part of the original rebellion and left. And they had no church. Actually, it was before 90. But there was no church there for years. April of 1992, 4 ladies from Chinle came to the Gallup conference to talk to Pastor Mitchell, and they asked Pastor Mitchell, please, would you plant a church in Chinle? I have a photo here. These 4 ladies, these precious ladies, there was no fellowship church. They said, Pastor Mitchell, please plant a church in Chinle. And Pastor Mitchell told them in April of 92, we have no man to send there. They came back in October and they told Pastor Mitchell, we found a man, you just need to send him. Who did they have in mind? Artie Aragon, who was assisting in Gallup, New Mexico. And so, because of those ladies' persistence, Pastor Mitchell approached Artie and said, are you willing to go to Chinle? And Artie, he always tells me this, Pastor Mitchell said, I need a 5-year commitment. You're going to stay for 5 years. That was in 1990. He's still there. Artie says, I was tricked. But this is what he did, and he went to Chinle. He says when they arrived, there was no building. Remember, the building that we built, they stole that, and the man who left the fellowship stole that. They kept it, so they had to meet in a classroom in the old kindergarten center for 2 to 3 months. Finally, one of the ladies gave them a house so they could have church. Lorraine Hardy gave them a house to use for church. He said, the house, you could have 8 chairs across and 6 chairs deep. There was no restroom in that house. If people needed to use the bathroom, the restroom, they had to go to a gas station or a nearby store. And where that building was is where the current restrooms in the building. Artie tells you cannot grasp unless you've been to Chinle even today after all these years. But going, when he first went, how difficult it was to live there. You're faced with the brokenness and the poverty. Everything you need to buy, you can't buy it in Chinle. You have to travel out of there. But Artie and Sandra Aragon took over there, began to love those people, and Artie began to preach the gospel. He began to preach hope and the power to change, and God began to save Navajos. Chinle, for those who are watching, you don't know what this is a reservation area in Arizona, Navajo reservation. Navajos started getting saved and they started changing. Powerful conversions. God was doing miracles in people's lives, and it established a testimony. It's a very small place. When someone would get delivered from drugs and alcohol, very soon everybody knew about it. And in a place where alcohol and drugs and suicide, domestic abuse are rampant, Artie and Sandra just preached the gospel, ministered, and loved people. One of the things about Artie's ministry there is funerals. Artie has done over 400 funerals since he has been there. He says, I'm teaching this in November of 2023. He says he's already done 51 funerals this year. Just an incredible need, but the church in Chinle has become a resource of blessing for the whole community. I want you to see pictures of the building here. That was in the original old building. Move on. Now this is the outside of the building that they have now. On the inside, I want to tell you, that's probably the nicest building in Chinle. It is beautiful. Artie Aragon is a craftsman. Everything is beautiful in that building. It gives dignity to the people. One of the things about Artie and the Chinle boys, the Navajo boys, they started coming when we started using the tent. The first time we used the tent, we used a company. They didn't even know how to set it up correctly. And so Ike Cook had to help them, but he needed help setting it up. The Navajo boys started coming with Artie to help us set up. Originally, we'd have a whole bunch of guys from everywhere come, but pretty soon, the boys from Chinle got so good at it, they basically did all the work. And they had it done. By the time we arrived to help, they had most of it done. And from 1990 until 2019, the last time we had the tent, January of 2019, there were always, you see here, that was the crew that came. They would work their butts off, tremendous workers. They would clean out Golden Corral, the buffet. The profits of Golden Corral plummeted every time they came. The locusts came and devoured everything in sight. But they were a blessing to Ike Cook and the Prescott congregation. We owe them a great deal for that. One of the powerful things that Artie started doing in Chinle, started making disciples, getting converts powerfully saved, but now he believed in the Navajos. He believed that natives could become powerful men of God. 1999, they sent out their first church. Sean and Hope Haven went to Kayenta, 50 miles away. And you have to understand, to plant churches on reservations, often it's a greater challenge because there are no buildings. There's no buildings to rent. There's no housing. If you're not from there, you can't get one. So to plant a church, they had to buy a mobile home for the pastor to live in. Sometimes they had to buy a mobile home for the church to meet in. And often, sometimes they'd get a house or an old abandoned building. Every time they plant a church, it involves a major building project that Artie has gotten involved in. They planted other churches in the Navajo Nation. Martin and Dina Haven in Fort Defiance, Arizona. Now we'll show you some pictures of these. This is the building, and in each of them I'll show you the couple, the family, and their church. That's Fort Defiance. Next one, Dan and Pam Lee are now in Kayenta, Arizona. That's their building. Miller and Charity Deadman pastoring in Winslow, the church that we originally sent a worker there, and here is the church in Winslow today. Dempsey and Cheryl Deswood are in Tuba City, Arizona. That is half Navajo, half Hopi, very unique place in the world. Kevin and Corinda Gray in Payson, Arizona. After Brother Hart did a crusade, got some people saved, and there is the church in Payson, Arizona. But what God began to do is not only are they planting churches, but now the word spread of what God was doing in Chinle, and people in other cities, in other reservations, even other tribes, they wanted a church to be planted. Cuba, New Mexico. A lady used to be in the Santa Fe church, Nancy Baca. She donated a building. She wanted there to be a Potter's House Church in Cuba, New Mexico. So she donated the building. We have here, this is Adam and Nia Braxton, who were pastoring there. They've moved on since there. That's Cuba, New Mexico. Pine Ridge, South Dakota. Now this is far away. People in Pine Ridge contacted Artie because they heard that there is hope. They heard in the incredible problems on the reservation is that Artie was preaching hope. People were changing, and they said, please come plant a church in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. Here's Patrick and Lauren Ashley, Shaw's Ashley. They are there in Pine Ridge. Rapid City, South Dakota. Chris and Erica Morgan. are there, and you'll notice both of these are daughters of Artie, who married Navajo boys, are now pastoring, and that's in Rapid City, South Dakota. Even internationally, the word would spread not just within the United States, but internationally. Artie was preaching in Saskatoon in Saskatchewan in Canada, and there they called natives First Nation. Some First Nation people came and they said, please, would you come and plant a worker here? And so Derek and Audrey Clouchy went there. In the town there in Saskatoon, there are approximately 30,000 natives. And so they planted from Chinle. They planted into Canada. And Chinle has planted other churches internationally. Winnipeg and Manitoba in Canada. Elijah and Anna Pete, next photo there, are in Winnipeg. Approximately 90,000 natives live in Winnipeg. But then they planted a church into Shanghai, China. And from Chinle, Donnie and Trissy Benally pioneered it. This was the first Navajo couple sent overseas from Chinle. There they are in Shanghai, China. There are some of their converts. That church is ongoing to this day. Donnie passed away from COVID in 2020, but that couple you see in the bottom right-hand corner, Martin and Jane Mawe, they took it over, are pastoring a church that was pioneered from Chinle, Arizona, doing a work for God there. And in October of 2023, just last month, out of the Gallup congregation, they announced going into Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, is Adam and Nia Braxton. They're going to Ho Chi Minh City. And so one of the things that God has done that is very powerful is because of the incredible need in Chinle, the suicide rate and just alcohol and drug addiction rates. Siri, shut up here. And Siri said, okay, see, she listens. But one of the very powerful things that has happened, because the testimony is so powerful, it has given them favor with officials. We have some pictures here. The first picture here is this is the mayor of Chinle, what they call the chapter house president. And these people will come to church because they know the testimony there. Next photo, let's see here. This is the former president of the Navajo Nation, Joe Shirley Jr. He was the president from 2003 to 2011, came to a camp meeting, and here the Chinle pastors are laying hands on the president. He came because of the testimony that he knew. The next picture, here is former President Jonathan Nez from 2019 to 2023. He came to a regular Sunday night service. He would attend events from time to time. And Artie said he had his personal phone number, was given essential business privileges during the COVID nonsense of 2020. And the final picture is the acting president, Bu Nigran, I guess is how you say it. He came to the camp meeting in 2023, spent 2 hours after the service talking with also the Navajo Nation Speaker of the House also came. And so normally our thing is we don't glory in the fact that politicians come. The only reason why that is impressive, the politicians came because of the testimony. It's not seeking out like we want somebody famous coming to our church. I'm telling you the work that Artie and Sandra have done in Chinle and the work that they are doing, raising up disciples. Artie gets invitations from many different tribes all across America, even, as I said, in Canada, other nations, that they want him to come because the testimony of what God has done. God has done a miracle in Chinle. And we rejoice. We thank God for Artie and Sandra and the Chinle Church. We are glad that they're a part of our community. Let's praise God and thank God for what he's done. God, we are grateful for your goodness.